Hello. Spring is almost here, and we welcome you to our March lecture on Starlite Terrace, a contemporary Jungian novel. And a warm welcome back to our guest speaker today from Zurich, Switzerland, and Heidelberg, Germany, Dr. Michaela Kopp-Marx. The first part of the program is about the novel itself, its Jungian worldview and depth psychological approach. It follows the events and conflicts among the tenants of Starlite Terrace apartments in Los Angeles. The second part will feature Rex. His name means king. He's the man at Noah's window who will be hit with an onrush from the unconscious. It's an allegory of a man suffering from a father complex. Dr. Kopp-Marx will discuss the significance of the window and focus on themes of the flood and divine storm that grip and transform Rex. Dr. Michaela Kopp-Marx is in training as a Jungian analyst at the Research and Training Center for Depth Psychology in Zurich. She is also professor of modern literature, German literature, at the University of Heidelberg. Her field of work is modern and contemporary literature as it relates to visual art, film, and architecture. She is interested in C.G. Jung's analytical psychology, especially in his theories of archetypes and symbols. She has published an annotated new edition of Patrick Roth's Price trilogy, as well as essays and anthologies on Roth's novels. And so we welcome Dr. Michaela Kopp-Marx.
Thank you, Virginia, for the kind introduction. Thanks for having me. I'm also grateful to Judy for the kind and thoughtful preparations ahead of this lecture. I wish you all a happy St. Patrick's Day. Tonight, or rather this morning, another Patrick is the focus of our attention. I'm, of course, referring to Patrick Roth and his novel Starlite Terrace. Some of you may remember my last talk 2 years ago about the second story of Starlite Terrace, Solar Eclipse, which dealt with the anima problem in the life of modern man. Today's lecture is mostly about the book's first story, the novel's first section, entitled The Man at Noah's Window. I will talk to you for about 90 minutes, and the last quarter of our 2-hour program is reserved for Q&A. I will also present some visuals to illustrate the story and will have the key quotes on slides for you to read along. If you haven't read the story yet, haven't heard it online, don't worry. I will give you all the relevant information. Of course, I hope that this lecture will make you curious about the book as a whole, the whole novel, really. So here's a brief plan, an overview of today's lecture. During its first half, I will talk about the book Starlite Terrace, in particular about its unique position in today's literature, and its explicitly Jungian approach. I won't interpret it in its entirety. There just isn't enough time. But I will pick out 2 or 3 central images and amplify the important motives of the hand, the window, and the flood. I hope we get there. I'm not sure, but I will try. So let's get started. I will begin by discussing why, from the depth psychological perspective, analyzing contemporary literature may be worthwhile. After all, one can rightly wonder what a novel set in our time might convey to us that we, as contemporaries, do not already know. It is at this point that a capacity good literature possesses comes into play, namely the ability to filter, condense, and mirror modes of thought, crises, and fashions that flourish in collective consciousness. It was Hegel, the German philosopher, who first made the time diagnostic power of the work of art, that means art's power to deliver a diagnosis of the times of history, the subject of philosophical reflection. A poem, a work of visual art, a piece of music, Hegel says in his introduction to the phenomenology of spirit, embodies a certain spiritus, typical of the time in which it was created. This spirit, which manifests itself in the work of art, is to him the spirit of the epoch. The epoch in Hegel's thought is synonymous with Geistgestalt, that means spirit shape, a word he coined. This is supposed to mean that a work of art is the product of the objective spirit that prevails in that epoch. Isn't that interesting? Taking Hegel's thought further, this would imply that the factor by which we distinguish one cultural epoch from another is the objective spirit that has mysteriously changed. So it is the altered spirit that separates one period from another in the course of history. What Hegel calls objective spirit is to Jung the historical or cultural dominant that changes autonomously in the collective psyche. Correspondingly, this cultural dominant impacts on the art of that epoch, of that period. Starlite Terrace, a contemporary novel in 4 stories about the American film milieu, is in this sense a product of our epoch, which philosophers refer to as postmodernism. I give you a brief summary of the setting and the content. The action takes place in an apartment building in Los Angeles called Starlite Terrace. Slide. The stories unfold in the years 2002 and 2003. Yeah, here you see the photograph of the Starlite Terrace apartment building in Dickens Street in Sherman Oaks. 4 tenants, Rex, Moss, Gary, and June, tell their Hollywood-tinged life stories to a 5th tenant, who is also the main narrator. He remains, by the way, nameless. Following their stories, it becomes clear that Rex, Moss, Gary, and June had moved to the movie capital at a young age, all of them attracted by the glamour of show business. In conversations with the narrator, they recount key events and turning points in their lives, great expectations and bitter disappointments. The 4 narratives, mostly rendered as dialogues, revolve around love and guilt, death and redemption, existential themes which find expression in archetypal images, such as in the dreams of the narrator. And so each narrative is based on biographical, historical facts embedded in a mythical supratemporal context. If you look at the surface of the text, it appears to be a record of American popular culture with countless references to movies and folk or rock songs of the 50s and 60s, musicians and film stars of that era. These pop cultural elements go hand in hand with biblical images and motives, such as Noah's Ark, the flood, the apocalypse, or even Jesus, who is present in the Daedalus of the cross, Rex Judeorum, which serves as a nickname for the protagonists of the first story, Rex, the man at Noah's window. The plot is composed according to the rules of suspense. That is, all four stories begin like a good drama in medias res, run toward a climax, and end in a lysis. The man at Noah's window starts out with a seemingly simple conversation in the deli. One episode follows another, and yet there is a hidden center around which everything revolves. We have this everyday atmosphere at the beginning with the common theme of the movies, and yet each sentence is full of hints that capture the reader because the images are interconnected and point to a uniform recurrent pattern. It is similar in each of the four stories. The complex, multi-layered world the novel creates seems tremendously authentic, and the protagonists appear to be cut from life. The language in which the stories are written seems comparatively simple. It is everyday dialogue that does not immediately show its polished nature. Each character is movie possessed, but Rex, Moss, Gary, and June are also searching for a redeeming power that carries and holds. There is clearly a religious need, a longing for something greater in life. Literary scholars are considering Starlite Terrace a brilliant testimony of the so-called seeker spirituality found primarily on the west coast of California. In fact, the novel is part of Patrick Roth's own life story, a condensation of his 44-year experience with the film city Los Angeles, where he arrived in 1975 to study filmmaking at the University of Southern California. Thus, in Starlite Terrace, we are dealing with literary fiction that relies heavily on biographical facts. This is also true in terms of the narrator. Interspersed hints to his person open up autobiographical references, his German origin, his extensive knowledge of film, and the narrative procedure of collecting slivers of life as material for dramatic stories. They all point to the identity of author and narrator and identify Starlite Terrace as autofictional prose. I find the figure of the nameless narrator quite interesting. He reminds me of a good therapist who is able to listen and stay in the background of events. He takes a back seat to his characters in order to let them have their say and to make himself as invisible as possible. And yet, as the secret director, he holds the reins of the entire drama in his hands. We only see the Starlite Terrace world through his subjective glasses. As a writer, the narrator is an eager collector of what I would call life shards. He assembles them into 4 stories. In this way, he gives form, order, and direction to the experiences of his 4 protagonists, which are fragmented into 1,000 images and stories. This means that the 5th draws the essence, the quintessential, from the lives of the 4. Roth himself likes to describe the narratives as fictionalized testimonies of people on the fringes of American film and music industries, shaped and assembled into 4 individuation stories. And as we can see, a 5th, his own individuation story. Indeed, it is through the narrator's seeing and understanding, through his sympathy and empathy, through his dreams, that the characters, dissociated as they are, experience meaning in life and glimpse something of the myth they unconsciously live. His relatedness to the inner psychic symbolic realm of the collective unconscious finds expression primarily in his dreams. The world of dreams is of utmost importance to Roth's narrative approach. The dreams in this novel are predominantly dreams in which the Starlite tenants appear precisely as personified aspects of the narrator's psyche. And so it becomes particularly clear that the narrator is mirrored in his characters, or rather that the protagonists represent portions of his own personality. The narrator is the 5th out of 4, as I said, but he is not morally above the others because he is just as involved in life and obsessed with film as they are. And yet, he possesses 2 crucial abilities that put him ahead of them. He has the reflective capacity of consciousness, and he is committed to the unconscious. Through the narrator's mythifying approach in presenting the stories, his sense of drawing analogies, his mirroring of personal experiences in universal images, a person like Rex, who lives entirely in projections, is elevated to the status of everyman. His is the condition of modern man. Later, I will point out that Rex's fatherlessness, his personal longing for relationship, become visible as a universal phenomenon by being embedded in a timeless mythical context. The reader realizes that Rex's fundamental lostness is ultimately his own as well. In this sense, we can argue with Hegel. Roth's novel truly captures the zeitgeist of postmodernism. It bundles together tendencies, problematic issues, and perceptions that are driving our time. Granted, there are many good novels that depict collective consciousness, everyday life, and social discourses of the present. But that is, of course, only one side of the coin. The invisible night side of our time, the psychic background of the unconscious, hardly ever comes into focus in contemporary literature. And when it does, it happens more or less accidentally. Many critics, especially in Germany, have repeatedly emphasized the singularity and incomparability of Patrick Roth's literature. However, there are certain parallels to a trend in contemporary American literature that literary scholars call post-secular fiction. This trend, post-secular fiction, to which authors such as Toni Morrison, Louis Erdrich, and to some extent Don DeLillo can be attributed, is characterized by an increased interest in religious questions and themes, a so-called new spiritual attunement. Post-secular fiction is generally understood to be aesthetically ambitious narrative literature that uses literary means to explore and reflect on new forms of religiously inflected seeing and being. To a certain extent, Roth is close to this trend, which is characterized by the inclusion of mythical, transcendental elements in the experience of the characters. However, his artistic approach far exceeds this. The inclusion of the world of the unconscious is absolutely essential to Roth's writing. The experiences his protagonists have with the unconscious trigger conflicts, but also convey new insights that give meaning and have a consciousness expanding effect. It is precisely this transformation in the wake of crisis that does not usually occur in works of post-secular fiction. They mostly end openly and without perspective. To highlight the distinctiveness of Starlite Terrace in today's literary world, I'd like to pick up on some of Jung's thoughts on the function of literature before I embark on my own analysis of the novel using the example The Man at Noah's Window. In the 1920s and 1930s, Jung spoke publicly about the, quote, relations between analytical psychology and the poetic work of art, unquote, and about the relationship between, quote, psychology and poetry, unquote. For Jung, the decisive factor in terms of quality and cultural value of literature is the relationship that a literary work has to the collective psyche. According to this relationship, Jung distinguishes two types of poetry: consciousness literature on the one hand, and visionary literature on the other. I repeat, he distinguishes conscious literature from visionary literature. Consciousness literature draws its material from the soul foreground, the passions, the personal life experience of an author. Visionary literature, on the other hand, relates to the soul background. That is, it shapes its world from the chaos of the uncreated, from dreams, nocturnal fears, and intuitions, premonitions that befall. In other words, this poet is open to the transpersonal level of the psyche, finding language and expression for the images and feelings that emerge in his dreams and visions. Jung describes the work of the visionary poet as follows. Slide. Quote, "It is to be expected that the poet will turn to mythological figures in order to give suitable expression to his experience. Nothing would be more mistaken than to suppose that he is working with second-hand material. On the contrary, the primordial experience is the source of his creativeness. But it is so dark and amorphous that it requires the related mythological imagery to give it form. In itself, it is wordless and imageless, for it is a vision seen as in a glass darkly. It is nothing but a tremendous intuition striving for expression. It is like a whirlwind that seizes everything within reach and assumes visible form as it swirls upward." Unquote. So how do we apply this to Roth's work? Well, we can safely say that in Starlite Terrace, the outer world of life, the conscious world, intertwines incessantly with the inner world of perception, the unconscious world, forming the two sides of the coin. Seen from the outside, the novel combines indeed very contrary realities. The American film milieu, with its semi-divine stars, its scenes and images from famous films like High Noon or Key Largo, comes face to face with biblical motives and mythical images from the collective unconscious. I will explain this in detail later using the story of the man at Noah's window. I'd like to dwell for a moment on this other, invisible, inner world of the objective psyche that opens up in Starlite Terrace. While reading the stories, you surely notice the dreams that are woven into the plot from time to time. In The Man at Noah's Window, it is the archetypal dream of the transcender that gives hope in the face of doom. In Eclipse of the Sun, it is an impressive flood dream that jolts the narrator. In the third story, Rider on the Storm, a character retells his childhood favorite film, which is a variation on the biblical flood myth. And the fourth story, The Woman in the Sea of Stars, contains the numinous dream of the cosmic horse's eye that heralds a new era. These powerful archetypal images correspond mysteriously with certain film images, so that deep beneath the surface of everyday events, the world of archetypes shines forth, appears in motion. These archetypes have an influence on the lives of the novel's heroes insofar as they are unconsciously driven by them. The psychic images fascinate the narrator so much because they appear in his own dreams. one senses that they are authentic dreams, not invented ones. Insofar as the psychic background is fundamentally included, the stories can be read on the level of the personal unconscious, represented by the narrator and his characters, and on the level of the collective unconscious, represented by archetypal dreams of the narrator, which obviously shed light on what is constellated in the unconscious. Starlite Terrace not only unites the everyday world of consciousness with the world of the objective psyche, it also gives the personal and the transpersonal point of view of the psyche. This is why I argue that Starlite Terrace represents a new kind of literature, a new poetics that strives to include the unconscious in the writing process, thus bringing together the separate spheres of the conscious and the unconscious. From Jung's point of view, it appears as a union of consciousness literature and visionary literature. So why is Starlite Terrace different? Patrick Roth has often described that he finds the material for his literature in the unconscious and is guided by the unconscious during the writing process. Dream scenes that arise during the process are enlarged, for example, with the help of active imagination, or entire dreams are incorporated into the story after they have been filtered, refined, and examined as to their meaning, often over a period of years. Thus, it is evident that the material of his literature does not come solely from personal life experience, but to a good extent from the unconscious psyche. However, and this is the big difference to literary role models such as Goethe or Hölderlin, whose poetry to a large extent is drawn from the transpersonal background, Roth works on his material with his whole knowledge of the psyche, a knowledge which he has acquired over many years as an author trained on Jung, Edinger, and von Franz. The remote and often intangible nature of the images of the primordial experience is captured in poetic language through the work of consciousness and his craftsmanship as a narrator. One could also say the original material, the prima materia, is received, filtered, reflected, and recast into contemporary modes of experience. Let's stay for a moment with the function of literature in general. What, in fact, is literature good for anyway? Delectare et prodesse, according to this famous formula by Horace, the task of art is to entertain, delectare, and benefit, prodesse, to educate the recipient morally while providing pleasure. Particularly the Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century saw its value in pleasing and instructing the audience. Today, most writers want to entertain above all. The aspect of instruction has become downright unpopular and has almost disappeared. It is no surprise that Jung, in keeping with the Enlightenment's Brot esse, benefit principle, strongly emphasized the educational mission of poetry. The poet should use his work to help the reader find access to the deeper sources of life. Visionary poetry, Jung writes, has a compensatory character and therefore a social significance. Slide. Quote, Jung, the creative process, so far as we are able to follow it at all, consists in the unconscious activation of an archetypal image and in elaborating and shaping this image into the finished work. By giving it shape, the artist translates it into the language of the present and so makes it possible for us to find our way back to the deepest springs of life. Therein lies the social significance of art. It is constantly at work, educating the spirit of the age, conjuring up the forms in which the age is most lacking. The unsatisfied yearning of the artist reaches back to the primordial image in the unconscious, which is best fitted to compensate the inadequacy and one-sidedness of the present. The artist seizes on this image and in raising it from deepest unconsciousness, he brings it into relation with conscious values, thereby transforming it until it can be accepted by the minds of his contemporaries according to their powers, unquote. What is particularly missing in our time is a conscious connection to the unconscious psyche, and thus to the religious dimension of life. Starlite Terrace tries to compensate for the general disconnection from the Seelengrund, the bedrock that is the soul, by making the transpersonal background visible as the other, the greater reality in everyday life. Patrick Roth himself has described his concern as follows. Slide. Oh, maybe the next one, I'm not sure. Yeah. So what is my assignment as a writer? Again and again, to relate the unconscious, the impersonal, numinous and timeless to the consciousness, to the personal individual, to the holy temporal sphere, and thus to create or reveal intersections of consciousness in the making where we stand to recognize the opposites that define us all, unquote. In this statement, you have Starlite Terrace, the whole book in a nutshell. I mentioned the structure of combining contrasting worlds. This same principle is already behind the title, which is mirroring the task of relating the opposites. Let me expand on this for a moment. And now we can go back one slide. Starlite Terrace has a highly symbolic meaning that is at the same time concrete and figurative. Here you see the building sign. Seen from the outside, it refers to a concrete, particular apartment building in LA. Seen from the inside, it refers to the eternal law of transformation of the opposites. The image of starlight alludes obviously to the cosmos, that is, the spirit world of the archetypes, the macrocosm. The second image, terrace, derived from Old French terre or Latin terra, earth, on the other hand, refers to the element earth and the flat surface of the earth, on earth, that is matter, and the microcosm. Such cosmic thinking and correspondences or counterparts is connected to ancient ideas of natural philosophy. The Hermetic text of the Emerald Tablet, the Tabula Smaragdina, is a famous example of this kind of thinking, which strives to unite opposites. You probably all know the modern paraphrase of the popular second verse of the Emerald Tablet. Quote, "That which is above is like to that which is below, and that which is below is like to that which is above," unquote. In this thinking, upper and lower, inner and outer are linked by hidden affinities and similarities. For example, the planets in the sky correspond to the metals in the earth. Sun is gold, moon is silver, Venus is copper, and so on. The world in Starlite Terrace, too, is organized according to this principle of correspondence. We could argue that the fragmented psyches of Rex, Moss, Gary, and June are connected by many small threads of motives to the timeless and primordial reality of the archetypes. The 3rd century Christian scholar Origen picks up on this holistic worldview when he emphasizes the interconnectedness of man's earthly existence with the cosmic world of the stars. Quote, Origen, "Understand that you are a second world in a microcosm, and that in you are the sun, the moon, and also the stars," unquote. It seems only logical that Patrick Roth should choose Origen's famous dictum as the motto for his novel Evoking Wholeness. The opposites of heaven and earth, of the symbolic archetypal and the earthly concrete reality, face each other in consciousness as separate spheres, but in the unconscious, they are one. The symbol of this inner connectedness is the stairway, the terrace that leads to the stars. This powerful image of the stairway recalls the Jacob narrative in Genesis. During his flight from Esau, Jacob saw angels in a dream ascending and descending as if on a ladder. Slide. The next one, please. Yeah. You have here the picture of William Blake, the illustration of Jacob's dream. Jacob's ladder stands on the earth and its top reaches to heaven. but at the top stands the Lord himself. Jacob called the place of this stream Bethel, house of God, because here was connection to God and the promise of new land and future generations. To sum it all up, the basic subject of Starlite Terrace is the conjunctio, the coming together of the opposites. The first sentence in Jung's Mysterium Conjunctionis comes to mind, quote, "The factors which come together in the conjunctio are conceived as opposites, either confronting one another in enmity or attracting one another in love," unquote. The opposites are seeking each other. They are looking for conjunctio. Edinger says, quote, "The conjunctio is the relevant symbol for modern man." As in alchemy, the conception, the worldview in Starlite Terrace is a holistic one. At its core, it is about conjunctio, the visualization of a relationship between the conscious and the unconscious that is given a priori. Yes, the stars in the title also represent Hollywood and its almost divine heroes. But above all, they are to be understood symbolically. From this perspective, the stars represent experiential lights from the depth of the objective psyche coming together to form new order. The terrace symbolizes the ascent to the larger, more comprehensive consciousness. The title thus already indicates that the striving for consciousness and wholeness is the theme around which the novel revolves at its core. Accordingly, the number 4 plays a major role. Starlite Terrace is, as you know, a cycle of 4 stories with 4 characters and the narrator as the 5th. In the stories themselves, the quest for wholeness becomes visible as a dynamic development in 4 stages. The ascent to higher ground begins in the first story, The Man at Noah's Window, and reaches its goal in the last, The Woman in the Sea of Stars. One can say it is a kind of alchemical process in consciousness that invisibly fuels the events in the background. From the dominant consciousness of the present Christian age, embodied in Rex, a new consciousness unfolds over the course of 3 stories. This new consciousness eventually manifests in the rise of the female archetype, personified by the figure of June, the main character of the 4th story. In the course of this dynamic, not only do the characters change, but so does the narrator, who at first merely seems to accompany the events. The fascinating thing about this organic composition, as I said before, is that the narrator, who is actually an objective observer, is transformed as he listens, reflects, and later writes down these stories. But this would mean that we must understand the book Starlite Terrace as the author's own vessel. In this aspect too, the parallel to alchemy is evident. Just as the soul drama of the adept is reflected in his royal art, his opus, so the individuation process of the writer is reflected in his art, the storytelling, the telling of the tale. His opus is the book he assists. Patrick Roth himself compares the work he is engaged in to an alchemist's vessel. Quote, "In it, in the book, my materia gathers. It lies locked in the various aspects of the characters who at first somehow fascinate me, haunt me, with whom I suffer, who won't leave me alone." Unquote. Okay, this is the first part of my lecture. And now I'm getting to the second part, my interpretation of the man at Noah's window, at least in one aspect, in the aspect of the hand of the father. And that is also on the paternal archetype. So the hand of father, my first paragraph. The man at Noah's window represents the starting point of a profound transformation process and is therefore particularly significant. The man at the window is Rex, an older gentleman who, like his neighbors Pete and the narrator, lives at the Starlite Terrace and derives his guiding principles, models, and ideals from the world of movies. The story Rex tells over breakfast at the local deli, Noah's, provides a deep insight into the problems of a man who, in the narrator's judgment, is an endless outsider. This fundamentally lonely man has spent his life unable to find his inner center. As the son of a father who beat him and abandoned his family, and of a mother who earned her living as a prostitute without a fixed abode and who died at an early age, Rex spent a large part of his childhood without parents, without a home, without security and safety. He himself describes his growing up as an adventurous odyssey through orphanages and adoptive families, always on the move to the next stop. Everywhere he ran into trouble, escaped, or was kicked out. He never wanted to fit in or submit to anyone. The fate of existential forlornness was mitigated at a young age by a strong individuation instinct. On that rain-soaked morning when the story begins, the man at Noah's window tells what kept him afloat through all the hardships. It was the imagery of the movies that gave the child comfort, strength, and the courage to face life. The story Rex tells right at the beginning illuminates how one must imagine this. The story is about the father, a supposedly good tap dancer, but whose true talent lay in his hands. As if to prove it, Rex recounts an episode from childhood, which Pete, another neighbor in Starlite Terrace, immediately exposes as a legend, although it contains its own psychological truth. This story was told on the day of Rex's father's funeral, told by a man who, like his father, worked in the film industry. Rex's father, according to this unknown man, had large, beautiful, and moreover, extremely skilled hands, which is why he was often hired by studios when close-ups during card games or shots of skilled gunplay in close-ups were required. The shooting of the Gary Cooper Western, High Noon, had just been completed, and the exterior location of the actual sets was within sight of the cemetery where Rex's father's funeral took place. So the stranger told Rex that his father had been working on the High Noon set as a hand double for Gary Cooper to get certain close-ups during the shootout. This is how Rex, motivated by the stranger's story, came to see his own father, this mostly unknown father, in the hands of Gary Cooper. The hands, his father's hands, had doubled. Slide. Rex claims that the big, strong hands in the shootout scenes of heroic town marshal Will Kane, played by Cooper, the only one in his town to stand up to evil and uphold justice, that those are actually his father's hands. This hand double fantasy weaves on as the years pass. It is superimposed on the life of a disloyal father whose hand the son never actually felt, never held. The unconscious has replaced the hands of an absent father with the reliable hands of Cooper. Rex has chosen a movie star as a father, whose roles gather all the positive qualities of the paternal archetype: respect, discipline, courage, intellectual authority, spiritual wisdom. When he was still a young man, so Rex continues his story this morning, he happened to see Cooper in a men's store and followed him from there down the sidewalk in hopes of getting his courage together to address him and to shake Cooper's hand. At that point in Cooper's life, the star had been diagnosed with terminal cancer and stopped by certain stores in Beverly Hills he used to frequent, certain people he knew, saying goodbye without saying the word. But just before the longed-for handshake with the star, a limousine stops curbside. Cooper gets in, one hand raised in salute to Rex, who came too late. The car drives off. Rex's tragical missing out on his chance is repeated on the level of the narrative's frame when the narrator, who had been listening to Rex's story all morning, leaves the deli without shaking hands. He has to catch a flight to Germany that afternoon and will be gone for a few months. For Rex, it was the last opportunity. He dies only weeks later, carried off by cancer, like his fatherly idol, Gary Cooper. What do we know about this father of Rex at all, apart from his bad reputation? It is said that he was a shoe salesman in Madera, California, and that he could perform magic with his hands. Card tricks and gun skills were his profession. In show business, this is called close-up magic. It is performed in an intimate setting, usually no more than 3 meters from one's audience, typically while sitting at a table. The close-up magician uses a set of techniques to secretly manipulate objects and to produce an illusion with the audience, Wikipedia tells us. This father, who could work miracles with his hands and who always worked closely with the stars his hands were doubling for, is representative of Hollywood itself, of the whole magic of film production, which is based on tricks, effects, and deception. Movie idols like Gary Cooper or Marilyn Monroe are artificial products of the film industry's image making. They are modern idols made of, quote, silver and gold, made by the hands of men, as it says in the Bible, Psalm 115:4. It is no accident that all these quasi-divine idols, these gods, are doomed in Starlite Terrace. Rex, for example, has witnessed the mortality of his idol directly, and yet the projection onto Cooper as father idol remains intact to the end. The fact that the circle of hands back to the father cannot be completed, that the longed-for conjunctio fails, is due to the conflation of the personal father with the numinous father image projected onto a movie star. For Rex, the father exists exclusively on the level of projection and is thus a complete illusion. Although this fact has saved the child from the worst, it is a projection and thus ought to be dissolved in accordance with the psychological rule that applies to the second half of life. Rex's fate, incidentally, also contains a warning to us readers not to identify with the substitute world of Hollywood. For the movie experience can short-circuit the personal search process for the transpersonal sources of life. The possibility of authentic experience of the greater reality is cut off insofar as the movie enthusiast is satisfied with magical cinematic moments instead of seeking the vivid archetypal images within his own soul. The external film images are technically manufactured arbitrary thrills that can be consumed without consequence and therefore must be constantly repeated. In contrast to the superficial illusionary film experience, an authentic experience of the archetype imposes itself from the depth of the unconscious and overwhelmingly defeats the ego, strikes it down, flattens it. The same occurs in the dream of the transcender that is experienced by the narrator. The legend of the father's hands, as curious and endearing as it seems at first glance, allows the negative aspect of Hollywood as an image factory to flare up in the story of Rex, namely as a dangerous temptation to remain attached to the shiny surface of illusion. Rex's lifelong search for hands is a brilliant allegory for someone suffering from the father complex. Edinger has succinctly summarized the problem of the child who has grown up without a father in ego and archetype. Slide. I have a quote from Edinger. Yeah. Quote, when the personal father is missing, and more particularly when he is completely unknown, as may happen with an illegitimate child, there is no layer of personal experience to mediate between the ego and the numinous image of the archetypal father. A kind of hole is left in the psyche through which emerge the powerful archetypal contents of the collective unconscious. Such a condition is a serious danger. It threatens an inundation of the ego by the dynamic forces of the unconscious, causing disorientation and loss of relation to external reality. If, however, the ego can survive this danger, the hole in the psyche becomes a window providing insights into the depth of being, unquote. Rex's obsession with hands corresponds to his obsession with the father archetype, which forces him to seek paternal acceptance everywhere instead of developing the paternal potential in himself. Shaking the other's hand, to Rex, it means feeling the father and all that is projected onto that figure. One might interpret the desire for the hand as the natural need of an unwanted, repeatedly repulsed person for relationship and protection. But the archetype behind this image tells us that the problem lies deeper. Because Rex has been almost completely denied the personal experience of the father, he is under the spell of the father god experienced by way of the hand. To corroborate this argument, we must ask ourselves what the hand represents in terms of cultural history. Its spectrum, the hand spectrum of meaning is immense, but a look at the Bible is sufficient for our purposes. There, in the Bible, and particularly in the Old Testament texts, we encounter the hand as a central mode of revelation of Yahweh, besides his voice. In fact, the hand has been linked to the Father God since time immemorial. It functions as his synonym, so to speak. Yod, the first letter of the tetragrammaton, Yod, He, Vav, He, was identified by the Kabbalists with God. The Hebrew word Yod means hand. This identity is vividly demonstrated in Yahweh's interactions with the prophets, for which the book of Ezekiel, among others, offers rich material. Slide. Here is one passage from the book of Ezekiel 8, 1-3. Quote, "While I was sitting in my house and the elders of Judah were sitting before me, the hand of the sovereign Lord came on me there. I looked and I saw a figure like that of a man. From what appeared to be his waist down, he was like fire, and from there up, his appearance was bright as glowing metal. He stretched out what looked like a hand and took me by the hair of my head. The Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven, and in visions of God, he took me to Jerusalem." Unquote. In this passage, the hand raptures the prophet. There are other places where it lies on the prophet and gives him strength, or it touches him and entrusts him with God's words, his revelations, his law. For example, God's hand writes the Holy Decalogue on the 2 tablets and hands them to Moses. In the frescoes of the synagogue of Douros Europos in Syria, they constitute the largest cycle of paintings preserved from antiquity. In these frescoes, God's miracle-working power is represented by the image of his isolated right hand. Slide. On this image, you see Ezekiel and the hand of God. The hand of God also appears in the scenes of Abraham's sacrifice or in the miracle of the Sea of Reeds. Here, slide, please. In the image of the miracle of the Sea of Reeds, there are 2 hands. The right one is placed upon the Israelites, the left one upon the Egyptians. Another example is to be found in Elijah when he raises the child of the widow of Sarepta. The hand of God generally appears in scenes dealing with death and salvation, or death and resurrection. It can also directly cause disease, pestilence, and death. In Jeremiah 15:17, Jeremiah says, quote, "I never sat in the company of revelers, never made merry with them. I sat alone because your hand was on me, and you had filled me with indignation." Unquote. The relationship of man oriented towards God, as well as the relationship of God turned towards man, finds its expression in the Bible through the image of the hand. It is the organ of executive and legislative power, of power and protection, but also of inspiration, and especially important for our story, of creation. When Rex in his imagination touches the hand, it is as if he were in the care of the Creator before time was created, in the care of the Father who formed the first human couple with his hand. One might say, the hand symbolizes at the deepest layer of human perception the primordial experience of a reality which totally encompasses. Something comprehends us, is greater than us, and has therefore also generated us. One may think of Jesus' last words on the cross. They are addressed to the Creator God. Quote, "Father, I commend my spirit into your hands." Unquote. The etymology of our word commend again uses the image of the hand, Latin manus. It literally means to give into the hands. So commend means to give into the hands. What Rex, who maintains a secret connection to the Christ, probably longs for ultimately is his personal apokatastasis by the healing hand of the Creator that puts him back together and makes him whole again. From a symbolic point of view, fatherlessness means being cut off from the spiritual center of life. Rex is the prototype of a man without roots, without inner life, and therefore living a life without meaning. For the collective, fatherlessness means the loss of traditional faith as seen in the erosion of Christianity in Western societies. In a way, Rex resembles all of us who, disoriented, live only on the surface of everyday life, filling the inner emptiness with the lives of others and appeasing our soul's natural urge for the thing in itself with artificial, schematized products of the entertainment industry. The question of how to approach the self often does not even come into view under these circumstances. Before we analyze Rex's state of mind further, we need to take another look at the role of the narrator. We shall see that the narrator in Noah's that morning takes on the role of a father in a certain sense. At first, his sympathetic interest leads Rex to gather together the fragments of his life, to bring scenes of his childhood to life in oral narrative, with all the associations, fantasies, and feelings that have attached themselves to them. Drastic events come into the light of consciousness. The institutionalized child's shameful discovery that his mother, drifting from place to place, sells herself to strangers. And the 11 years old's traumatic confrontation with her death. Then Rex suddenly comes to a realization that gives him a new perspective. The parents, almost unknown to him, met next to a movie theater called Rex. This Rex also happened to be the movie theater of his childhood, to which he owes countless film experiences. It was there in this movie theater called Rex that his father saw the young Gary Cooper in his first roles. This unexpected discovery to be named after the beloved movie house forms the turning point of the conversation with the narrator. Rex has circumambulated one memory space after another to finally arrive at the childhood movie theater of Madeira and to become aware that his lifelines converge here and at the same time radiate into the future. Rex now has an inkling of why he had to live what he lived. He has rediscovered the key to the magic of childhood, which was buried under a mountain of negative experiences. 3 times a week, 4-hour rituals, full of screen adventures, which to a suddenly invigorated Rex conjure up reconciliatory visions of his fundamentally wayward parents. That Rex's secret is to be found in this movie theater communicates itself also to the narrator, who comments, quote, as if suddenly, instead of always seeing himself as an accident, as an abortion his mother hadn't succeeded in carrying out, he had been moved by this insight into the center, or at least closer to the center, unquote. At this turning point, the narrator intervenes. He briefly takes over the narrative direction and makes Rex's story his own by spinning it out mythologically, or rather by enhancing it. With Rex, he plunges once again into the darkness of the childhood movie house in Madera, California, where the parents, newly in love, sit happily united in front of the screen. Slide. I give you the quote of this event. Quote, and what were they whispering about? It is the narrator who's asking and who is answering here. It was about his name, the name they would give him. While he was still in her belly, his name had long since captured their imagination and was whispering to them what he should be called. It came from the screen, that name did, through the ready fabric, through the smoke from cannon salvos, waving pennants, whizzing arrows and lances, as a battle in black and white raged around the fortress. It zoomed over the rows of the spectators, staring open-mouthed at the screen, wormed its way into his father's ear and from there to his mouth. And he leaned over to whisper to his mother the inspiration that had reached his tongue, unquote. While the double bills of westerns, gangster movies, and comedies flicker across the screen, in the narrator's imagination, Rex is sitting behind that screen. And at the same time, he is seated in his mother's womb in front of the screen. How are we to understand this? Does Rex have a dual existence as a supratemporal being that has always been there, and concurrently as an earthly, still unborn being inside the mother? On the one hand, Rex is the movie house that bears his name, and the parents sit in it. On the other hand, he is contained as an embryo in the mother, who sits in a movie theater. Behind this paradox, there actually lies an ancient idea. The idea that every human being has his or her own star, a representative in the sky that constitutes his or her cosmic mirror image. It's the idea that you have a star of destiny to guide you. Jesus once reminds the disciples that their names are written in heaven. And he himself was identified at his birth with the Star of Bethlehem that outshone all others. This mythical idea is most poetically expressed in Wordsworth's Ode on Intimations of Immortality from Recollections of Early Childhood. Quote Wordsworth, "The soul that rises with us, our life's star, hath had elsewhere its setting, and cometh from afar." Unquote. What in Wordsworth is the star, for Rex is the movie theater and its screen, which radiates light like a star. In the narrator's vision, the movie house becomes the transpersonal center of Rex's identity. And this is indeed true, considering that Rex identifies with movies and movie stars throughout his life and derives his guiding principles from movies. In the narrator's vision, Rex is the ruler of the House of Rex, the godlike regent who hands his name to his parents via the screen. It is thus accorded to him that even before his earthly existence as the son of his parents, he already existed as the founder of a mythical movie empire. To really understand the meaning of this construction, it is helpful to look at Jung's definition of the individual. Slide. So I give you Jung's definition of an individual, quote, "The psychological individual or individuality has an a priori unconscious existence, but it exists consciously only insofar as a consciousness of its peculiar nature is present. That is, insofar as there exists a conscious distinctiveness from other individuals." Unquote. In his fantasy, the narrator ascribes to Rex that a priori existence by elevating him to the ruler of the House of Rex, according to the model of Israelite royal dynasties. You probably all know the House of David, for example. One can assume that the narrator wants to dignify Rex as a unique individual who has a transpersonal origin and a preordained destiny in life. Let us look further at the narrator's vision. The next mythic image represents a self-baptism and a self-begetting. Quote, "It, the name, zoomed over the rows of the spectators, staring open-mouthed at the screen, wormed its way into his father's ear and from there to his mouth. And he leaned over to whisper to his mother the inspiration that had reached his tongue." Unquote. Here, the movie screen acts as a fertile matrix that releases the name Rex from itself giving birth to it, and baptizing it at the same time. How does this work? By the name finding its way to the inner ear of the father, who then passes it on via his tongue as phallus into the ear of the mother. We know such a process of procreation from medieval Christian iconography as conceptio per aurem. This is conception through the ear. The Virgin was imagined to have been impregnated by divine rays of light entering the ear. So the parallelism of conception via ear suggests a delicate parallel between Rex and Jesus. But let's listen a bit further. Slide. He, quote, he the prompter, the guide, Rex, who had whispered from his screen to his parents, telling them what name they should give him. Long before he glimpsed the light of the world, while he was still the light of the world, every evening after work, in the light-dappled darkness of the Rex, 3 times a week, space, light and sound, priced and reasonably priced, the Rex ritual, unquote. The word light is the key word in these lines. It occurs 4 times within 4 lines. The context in which it is used has at least 3 aspects of meaning. First of all, light is the medium of film projection, light-dappled darkness. At the same time, light is the basis for creation, space, light, voice. And finally, light is a manifestation for the divine, light of the world. All 3 aspects of the meaning of light, cinema, film, the story of creation, and the divine, overlap and intertwine in their attribution to Rex. A few remarks on this point. Rex is called regent, steerer. This word implies the king, as we have already seen. The Latin verb regere, meaning to steer, to regulate, is a derivative of Rex. The king as such is, as James Fraser had documented, traditionally God's representative on earth. Rex, the king, has created his own universe, precisely his house of Rex, in which he spent happy childhood days. The universe of Rex is the cinema. Like creation out of the darkness of the primordial light, Genesis 1, 3-5, film is born out of the darkness of the movie hall. With this comes the claim that a film can represent an entire world and well beyond. Think of the names of major Hollywood film production companies such as Universal Studios. The light metaphor appears most prominently in the phrase light of the world, used twice in a double sense. Once as seeing the light of the world, a metaphor for being born, and a second time as being the light of the world, which is a direct quote from Jesus in the Gospel of John. I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. John 8:12. Here then another Christ parallel shines forth, one that places Rex close to the Messiah. If one wonders what all the fantasy is about, what function it has within the story, it is obvious that in these few lines, an origin narrative has been created for Rex. It is as if the narrator wanted to return something of the strangeness and mystery, the marvelous and the numinous of myth, to an emptied life in profane times. And so he elevates a shabby little movie theater in provincial California to the birthplace and center of a unique individual. Patrick Roth himself describes his mythifying method in an interview. I'd say one of my goals in writing is to let the connective tissue, that is the forgotten and dried up connective stuff between the surface of our everyday experience and the underlying archetypal material, grow again in order to enrich it again. The reader, if at all possible, should have the experience of rediscovering the deeper pattern behind the banal surface detail, behind the seemingly trivial event, unquote. In terms of literary history, we would have to speak of a modern variety of the re-enchantment of the world, which German Romanticism from Novalis to Eichendorff strove for around 1800. Formulated in depth psychological terms, we would say that the narrator connects Rex with the archetypal background of life, to which he himself has no access. From this connection to symbolic life, healing power flows to Rex, and the feeling of being, quote, closer to the center, unquote. Okay, I think I'm gonna stop here. Yeah. I have more, but it would be too much, I guess.
Well, thank you. That was really interesting. In fact, it was too interesting. I kept forgetting to advance the slides.
Oh, you did. You did great. Thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to turn off the recording